Today I'm speaking with Dr. Steve Mason. Dr. Mason, thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure.
And you and I have spoken several times now. It's so good to have you back again. And I've been thoroughly enjoying your interviews as well with Derek Lambert on MythVision. If anyone hasn't seen those, I'll have a link to go to Derek's channel. Please like and subscribe to Derek as well. He's doing some great work. And you all have had some fascinating topics, especially with the Historians Workshop and your John the Baptist interviews. So I thank you for all the information you're bringing to our attention. And in terms of just before we get started with our chat, and by the way, we're going to chat today about the Essenes, which is really fun. But I just want to give a brief bio, very brief. I've given long bios for Dr. Mason before, so I'll keep this one really short. But Dr. Mason is a historian of the ancient Eastern Mediterranean world, specifically under Roman rule, with a focus on Roman Judea. And you've been a teacher for many years. You're now retired, but you've extensively studied, especially the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus and Christian Jewish-Roman relations. You've got endless books, a lot of them about Josephus and about the Jewish War, about Roman Judea. So I'll have links beneath our video if anyone wants to kind of dig deeper here. And I'm going quick for the sake of time, but if anyone wants to dig into Dr. Mason's books, please go check them out. And at that point, I just wanted to say again hello to you and say thank you again for coming to our channel. How have you been doing?
Hey, I've been doing great. Thank you very much, Tim. It's always a pleasure to be with you and with your audience. This is a great opportunity for me to bring out stuff that, I've worked on, I've written on, I've taught about in the university to your audience, a bigger audience of people who are there because they want to be there, people who follow up your YouTube channel, not because it's course credit, but because they're interested and they really want to learn about this stuff. So for me, it's a great thrill to be able to engage those people, your people, my people, this way through your YouTube channel. So thank you for the invitation. I'm always honored to be part of your operation here, and thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're excited about this topic. So many of us, and this is just going to be a brief intro maybe to our topic today, but so many of us who have left Christianity, who've escaped the Bible prison, as I like to say, who've deconverted, there is the effect of saying, well, now that I'm out, what was I in? And one of the biggest questions that comes up a lot is, where did this thing even start from? What are the origins? And obviously, we could go much further back in terms of looking at Mesopotamia and Egypt, so forth. But we're going to zoom in today on a subtopic, and that is the question of the Essenes. And I just wanted to ask, is I know you're going to probably launch a presentation in a minute, but before you do launch that, could you just, for anyone that doesn't know who the Essenes were, could you just give a very general background? What does Essene even mean?
Yeah. No, the Essenes are really, really important, and they've been known about for 1900 years, 2000 years, better part of 2000 years, continuously, because they're described by various ancient authors whose works were copied and transmitted through those 2000 years. So they are not a group like, that like the Qumran community. I'm going to make a distinction later on between these, but groups we only discovered later on in the 20th century through, through new archaeological work or by chance circumstance. They're not like that. This is a group that's been known about, and they fascinated thinkers ever since. So from the 18th century onward, with the development of the Freemasons, for example, they, in the time we call the Enlightenment, they looked back to the Essenes as a kind of model of who they were. And then in the 19th century, with Reform Judaism, many scholars looked back to the Essenes and saw maybe they were related to the rise of Christianity in some way. And already in the ancient world, some people thought that Essenes were very similar. There's another group that Philo talks about called Therapeutai, whom I will not be talking about, but he kind of brings them together. And some people thought the Therapeutai were sort of proto-Christians, something like that. So these people are very much part of the scenery. Josephus mentions them alongside Pharisees and Sadducees as one of what he calls three groups in Judea. But we'll talk a little bit about that as we go on.
And just to clarify too, and you can launch your presentation here in a minute if you want to, but is it fair to say that the Essenes are not mentioned in the New Testament as far as you can see? They're not directly mentioned.
I can tell you for a fact that they're not mentioned in the New Testament. Okay. Not only as far as I can see, but in fact, even farther than I can see. And I don't mean to make light of your expression, Tim, but just to say it with clear emphasis, they are not in the New Testament at all. And that's a curious thing. Why aren't they? We can maybe
I may be jumping the gun on that. I know you're going to cover some of this. One other question, then, and I'll let you get started. How far back are we talking about in terms of who these people were? Were they around for thousands of years before Christ, hundreds, decades?
Well, that's already an interesting question. The sources differ on that. Josephus dates their origin to the 2nd century BCE. At least he first mentions them then and says around this time there were these groups. But Pliny says that they were there from countless generations past, the thousands of generations past. So he thinks they're like some kind of a quasi-tribe. But anyway.
Interesting.
And other scholars, before the appearance of the Qumran scrolls from 1947 onward, some scholars linked the Essenes back to some biblical groups, way back in the time of like the early settlement of Canaan, way back then, 1,000 years before. So before Christ. So
interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's not clear how long they've been around, gotcha. Or indeed where they came from or where they got their name from. These are all debated issues, most of which I won't spend much time talking about because we simply don't know. But I'll go through the evidence with you.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Take us away.
Okay, let me just share my screen here. And what I'm sharing is this presentation. And what I hope will happen is that you can see the full screen. Can you?
I can. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So what I'd like to do then is look at this simply as a historical question. Now, Tim mentioned a thing I did with Derek Lambert called the Historian's Workshop, and I won't repeat all of that here about how we do history, but very simply to hit the conclusion of it, because I've structured what I want to say to you here today as a historical investigation. So what does that mean? Well, this image, which I happen to like very much, represents for me life. It's just like chaos. It's things happen without telling us what they mean. There's a car accident outside, somebody falls over. Here in the Netherlands, probably somebody on a bicycle, well, actually doesn't happen that often, falls over. These are not stories with meanings. They don't have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and they're not dramas. They're just things that happen. And then each person involved shapes them according to their own meaning. So stuff just happens, as a common expression has it. The polite version of the expression is stuff happens. So the human past is kind of chaotic, but it leaves behind some artifacts, texts, buildings, objects, coins, bits and pieces, therefore, from different periods survive to our time. And these bits and pieces can be of, all that kind. Now, when the actual past is gone and we're living now in the present, we've only got the bits and pieces. We don't have real life anymore. We don't have the life that produced the bits and pieces, the artifacts. We only have them to study. So when we want to go and look at the past, how do we do it? Well, to put it very simply, I think we pose a question or problem about the past that we want to investigate. Then we gather the evidence that is relevant to that question, and we interpret each survival. What is this thing? What is this text? What is this coin? We have to understand what each thing is. And then when we've got all the evidence, just like a detective, you've got a dead body here, a knife in the back. Okay, so my question is, who killed this person? Then I try to look at the evidence. Okay, what can I figure out about the material evidence, the physical evidence, and were there any witnesses? Were there any people who saw something that happened before and after this? So I gather the evidence, and then, just like a detective, I try to come up with the best explanation of the evidence. I try to hypothetically reconstruct the lost reality, the real live world that produced these remains. All right. So you with me?
Yep.
That's basically the process. So if we apply that to the Essenes, the question is, who were the Essenes? Who were this group? So our first project is to interpret all the sources that mention Essenes, that describe them. And those are three. A writer named Philo of Alexandria, a Roman writer named Pliny the Elder, and Flavius Josephus. Each of them has a description. Each of them is a contemporary of the Essenes and has a description of them. So our first, job one is to interpret what they say. And then we hypothetically reconstruct what sort of group would explain all this evidence, because these are three independent writers. So they have three independent perspectives on the Essenes. So if we can understand what each of them says, then we can kind of say, okay, well, if the Essenes were like this, would that explain their views? They don't agree entirely with each other, but you can see there's the same sort of group they're talking about. At the end of that is where we ask, now what about proposals about Qumran? Many of you will have heard about, all of you will have heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran scrolls. You probably know that many people consider them Essenes. But also some people have proposed that John the Baptist was an Essene, or Jesus was an Essene, or, I don't know who else. The early Christians were Essenes. So these are all fair questions, but they're part of that hypothetical reconstruction. So you want to say, well, okay, if the Essenes were really the people of the scrolls, how would that explain the evidence in Philo, Pliny, and Josephus? Because they're the only ones who actually mention the name Essene and describe Essenes. So they are our most important text.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah. So in other words, we want to reconstruct the Essenes. Yeah, go ahead.
When you mentioned those three people there in point two, those are obviously talking about it from a historian's perspective. They were, telling people what they saw, but did it drop off? Like, were there any other historians after that talked about them, or was anyone else who talked about them after that just kind of basically trying to do what we're doing, which is try to interpret what happened in the past? Like, did they just drop off the scenes, so to speak, or?
Yeah. Apparently, they dropped off the scene sometime after 70. So many of you will know that in 70 CE, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. Jerusalem itself, the city, was destroyed. So the heart of Judean culture was destroyed. Now, it does seem that the Essenes survived that for some time. They lived on in their various locations around the place, but then they fade from the scene. So the only contemporary sources we're sure about are Philo, Pliny, and Josephus. And I should add that these are not all historians. Josephus is a historian, but he's trying to mold them into his literary purposes, as we'll see. Pliny the Elder is not a historian. Well, he wrote a work called Natural History, but it's much more about geography and botany and flora and fauna and things. And he was actually a kind of, we would call him an admiral. He was captain of the fleet of Roman naval fleet. He was basically a polymath, learned. He was learned in all kinds of areas, practical, especially more than theoretical, philosophical. And Philo is more of a philosopher than a historian. So he uses them for his philosophical purposes to illustrate the philosophical life. But we'll come to all those.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Now, the main scholarly views of the Essenes, because as I said, they've been known for 1900 years and fascinated readers. We want to look at those views before the Qumran scrolls came along. When the Qumran scrolls were discovered, soon after that, by the early 50s, most scholars, in a kind of a whoosh, like a stream, decided that these were Essene texts. So we're going to probe a little bit about why they made that identification, which I'm not very certain about. And indeed, many scholars today are not. But that view depended on three hypothetical guessed connections. So we're going to look at the Essene descriptions, then the Qumran scrolls and caves, and then the Qumran site. And in the common view that took root in the 50s, 1950s, those three were welded together, right? They're the same. It was thought they were the same group. So we're going to pick apart some of that. Since about the 1990s, it's been increasing doubt about this view. It's been either qualified, people say, partly true, but has problems, or just rejected outright. So the most common view is that nowadays, since the 1990s, is that Qumran is Essene, but it's just one small Essene site, and they were distributed all throughout the land. That the caves and the scrolls in them were only partly Essene products. They're a much bigger kind of library. We'll come back to that. Or many people now would say the Qumran site is unrelated to the caves, first of all, and the scrolls found in them, and unrelated to the Essenes. And so part of that view is some scholars think that the scrolls communities, that is, if you read the scrolls, the mentality of the groups involved there do not really match very well the Essene descriptions, and in many cases contradict them.
Can I ask
yeah, go ahead.
When you look at that, one of the issues that's come up in my mind a lot with a lot of topics that we would probably be able to talk about is the idea that what is true in one particular manuscript is not necessarily the only part of the story, because the manuscript changes. What's true of a certain group of people might not be true always. You know, the different groups change. And so is there any chance that in this there is an inclusion, there's a sense that something may have at one point been one way, but that doesn't mean it was that way the entire way, versus just they were never connected? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm glad you raised that, Tim. Actually, that's one part of the, when I said that. So the simple view from the 1950s, what was, these are all Essenes, and Qumran is the main Essene site, right? And they produced the scrolls, they copied the scrolls, they put them in the caves. So it's all a neat unity here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but on this triangle here, it's a neat kind of three-cornered, family of connections. But one of the ways that's been qualified is to say, not only is it possible that this is just one tiny Essene site, and actually most Essenes were somewhere else doing different things, but also the chronological argument you raise. So if you try to match up the very different things that are said about Essenes versus what's said about the scrolls communities, one way to explain that is to say, well, they changed. The scrolls were written in 100 BC or something like that, and the people Josephus is describing in the mid-1st century CE are different because the groups evolved in some ways. That's already possible. But the question you have to ask as a historian is, well, why do we think they're connected in the first place, right? So it's special pleading if you say, yeah, but I think they were the same, and I can explain away all the problems. They changed, this happened. These are all possibilities, but they beg the question. That is, it's a circular argument, because you still have to deal with the question, why did you make them the same in the first place? Yeah. So you could, in other words, you could say, yeah, I think John the Baptist was in Essene. Why doesn't he match all the, descriptions of the Essenes? Because, he was different, or he changed from those descriptions. Or I think the Christians were Essenes. So you see what I mean? You can make an unfalsifiable argument just by saying, yeah, but things were different, things changed. So
and we probably should add, right, that they're just because they might be different, we might not conclude that they were the same group. There could still have been some significant influence, right, amongst the groups where they're kind of like, Republicans and Democrats in the United States are obviously not the same, but there might be some influence where eventually, at certain points they might decide to collaborate for one particular topic, and other points someone might cross the aisle and say, I'm switching sides, where there might be some influence, even if they're still in some ways not the same group at all.
Yeah, that's true. But then it's also true that other groups were also, so in real life, what you're saying is, it's very complex. We're all being influenced by lots of things. So yeah, Democrats influence Republicans, but Supreme Court influences them and vice versa. And, economic conditions influence them, cultural issues, COVID-19 influences us. So yes, the Essenes could influence the Christians, but also could the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and all kinds of other groups, right? You see what I mean?
Yeah.
The problem is to isolate influences is very difficult.
I think you're bringing up a really good point. And I'll shut up after this, but I think it's what you're saying to me. If I could have a takeaway from this, is sometimes it's tempting to look for the easy answer, and just to say, I want this to be a really simple equation. I want it to be somewhat black and white. And yet there's beauty in admitting that there's nuance, there's gray area. And sometimes it's really important too, to always kind of keep your hands open. Like, this is a tentative assessment. And with new information, say we discover, 20 new caves in Qumran that we never found before. All of a sudden the story evolves again. Like, that we're just saying, based on what we know now, this is what we think is possible, but we are not dying on this hill because, like you said, we're filling in blanks in the history that we don't know at all. And I love that I think we've alluded to that in other interviews, but just the idea of saying, I'm not trying to make a stand and say, this is what I believe, they're definitely the same or they're definitely not. Just saying, let's talk about the evidence. And then, let's also be humble enough to say, there's probably more to this story that'll come out eventually, and we might have to shift a little bit.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. And it's not really humility necessarily on my part, but thank you. It's also just simply, this is not church, right? History is not about belief. And this gets confused sometimes, especially in these areas about early Christianity, ancient Judaism. People who held one belief system want another belief system. I don't believe that anymore. Now I want to know what I can believe. It's a difficult process to get through, but it's really important to say that history is not about beliefs, and beliefs are not allowed, because if you become attached to, just for the reason you said, Tim, if you become attached to a conclusion and you're willing to die on that hill, no matter what the evidence, then you can't be a historian, because a historian is someone who has to keep explaining the evidence. When the evidence changes, you have to come up with a better explanation.
Yeah.
But the other part of this is it's not just that we don't know everything. I think to keep it in perspective, we know almost nothing. Like, if you look at that, go back to that image I had of chaos, just going in all kinds of a billion directions. If you think of that as real life right now, I don't know what my next door neighbor is doing, or on any side or above me, downstairs. I don't know what's going on. When my children were living at home, I had no idea what was in their minds. And that's in my own house, right? We don't know what our politicians are doing. And that's today. That's today, when we have all the media, all the evidence we can possibly imagine at our fingertips, the internet and everything. So how can we possibly know what people were doing 2,000 years ago? And here's something that's really deceptive, is that we have some evidence like Josephus or Philo, and we fool ourselves into thinking this is some kind of adequate picture of how life really was. And then we become insistent and say, no, I see a clear parallel between what Josephus says and what this scroll says, and that's it. And I'm devoted to that. I'm sure that that's the case. Yeah, well, that's just, that's not okay, for a historian, because you have to realize that what you're seeing is a tiny, tiny sliver of everything that once was, right?
Yeah. It seems like it's a perspective too that allows you to keep yourself more open to the other alternatives, and to try to stop getting yourself, as we all do sometimes, we get locked into this interpretation and we end up having to kind of, as you said, explain away other stuff that doesn't quite fit, and instead just to say, like, let's let the evidence land where it lands. So, anyway.
And realize that the evidence doesn't speak for itself. This is a major misnomer. We often say, let the evidence speak for itself. It doesn't. It can't speak. It's just what survived. It doesn't tell us what it means. We have to come up with that ourselves, and that's a big challenge. So that's why we end up having debates, which is great, as long as we're not too wedded to them. So today I want to look at all three of these issues, but I'll focus first on the ancient descriptions of the Essenes to give you, I'm sure most people don't have the freedom and opportunity to investigate these sources. So I want to give you a quick impression of these authors and why they talk about the Essenes and what they say about them. So first of all, Philo of Alexandria. We don't know his exact dates, but roughly in this period. So he, in mid-first century CE, he's gone, he dies. So what do we know about him? Well, he comes from a very elite family in Alexandria, one of the three major Roman cities, Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria. And Alexandria was reportedly, Strabo says, the second largest city in the Roman Empire. And he's a member of the elite there. He's a Jew. He's a Judean. But his family apparently has citizenship in Alexandria, which is a very special thing. And at least some of his family members have Roman citizenship on top of that. So, I mean, this is a very elite family. His brother is super elite. He's in charge of tax collection. His name is Alexander, and he's well connected. Alexander is well connected with the imperial family of the Emperor Claudius and Claudius's mother. And Alexander's son, who is Philo's nephew, will become a very high-ranking Roman official, even though he's a Jew. His name is Tiberius Julius Alexander. He will become the governor of Judea, and then later the governor of Egypt, which is a major Roman province. And then he goes on even to greater things than that. So Philo comes from a very elite family, and he's fully engaged with Alexandrian culture, but in a very outward-looking way. He's not just concerned about observing the Torah, Jewish observance, but he writes in Greek. He's very familiar with Plato and Greek philosophy. He also respects foreign philosophers, and he integrates Judean thought in a philosophical kind of scheme. But for all of that, he remains totally devoted to the Judean law and customs, which he explains in a philosophical manner. He's also politically a leading member of the Alexandrian Jewish Judean community. He goes on a trip to see the Emperor Claudius to defend their rights or their protections, at least, in Alexandria. He also has visited Jerusalem at least once, possibly more, for a pilgrimage festival like Passover, something like that. He knows Judea very well. His family is politically connected to the leaders in Jerusalem. And he uses the Essenes to illustrate his ideals of what it means to be the Jew. When he's writing to non-Jews, non-Judeans, in 3 different works, and at some length, he decides that he wants to use the Essenes to illustrate what it really means to be a Jew, a Judean. He clearly admires them. So what does he say about them? And that's our first question, is in these 3 accounts, what's the basic impression you get of the Judeans, of the Essenes? And what kind of group can we imagine as historians that would fit this description? So in the biggest and fullest description is in the work of his called Every Good Man is Free. We would say today every good person is free, by which he means it's a kind of Stoic argument that you cannot be enslaved. You may think that, your boss at work is like crushing you, and, stuff around you is squashing you into a little ball and affecting you. And the Stoics, of course, said, not true. If you pursue virtue, you are free, because freedom is internal. So they give the example, Philo gives the example of a lion. And he says, this wealthy Roman buys a lion. So in theory, the Roman guy owns the lion. All right. He said, that's not true. The lion doesn't know that he's owned, right? Just one look from the lion at the owner, and it's clear who owns who, right? Who's in charge. And he uses that as an illustration of, like, even if you're a slave in the Roman Empire, you don't need to be a slave internally. You can be free. How do you be free? Because you realize that nothing external to you can actually touch you, even to the point of death. Let go of life, and then you have no fears. You cannot fear anything. You cannot be a slave of anything. This is Stoic thinking. So he says here, being unenslavable means being unconcerned not only with dying, but also with poverty, bad reputation, pain, whatever other things the masses assume to be bad. Everybody says, that's bad if you're in poverty or you're in pain. And he says, no, it's not. You can live a happy life. You can, or at least a contented, peaceful life. Because to be good is to be free. And such people generally avoid the masses. They don't like to be in crowded spaces because those are corrupt. They prefer to live outside cities, in villages. And he gives many examples of free people in Greece, in the Far East, some Indian philosophers. And then he says, hey, you know what? Syria also has a group of such people, and they are the Essenes. They engage in agriculture and crafts. They pool their wages together. They care for the old and sick among them. They open their homes to each other. They share their clothing and their food. And they are like the Spartans. Now, this is very important. He uses a word for their common meals. They have meals together. That is typical. It's a word taken from Sparta. So, in ancient Sparta, this was a city in which, indeed, everybody lived communally. There was no individuality, individualism. Everybody had meals together, common property. You could not own, wealth of your own. You shared everything. You shared even wives. Children grew up separately from their fathers. A very kind of communist system taken to an extreme. And then he says that of the Essenes, he said they have these meals together, and he uses the Spartan name because Sparta had a great deal of prestige in the Roman world. And he says also they set aside one day a week for active moral instruction. They're not instructed in logic and physics like many philosophers like, but in moral instruction. Every Sabbath they hear from the Torah of Moses about virtue. And he used this expression that he likes very much. They are athletes of virtue. Athletes of virtue. That is, they really undergo rigorous training and discipline. And for that reason, they're highly respected, even by the most brutal of rulers. He may be thinking of King Herod here, because we know from Josephus that King Herod respected the Essenes and looked to them for guidance. But so these passages are filled with his own vocabulary, right? He's not just reading from some common sheet about these people. So such words like good man, kalokagathos in Greek, fellowship, koinonia, association, thiasos, the common mess, the sousitia, and these athlete forms of words. These are all typical of Philo's way of writing. So his presentation of the Essenes is fully part of his portrayal, right? It's not just how they would have said they were, but it is a thoughtful and deliberate portrait. And the point is, he turns to them when he wants to be able to illustrate to his audiences what Judea has to offer, in the world scene. So he's talked about Greek philosophers, Indian philosophers in the Far East, and he says our people are these Essenes. They're really, really top-notch philosophers. So here's just to give you a little taste of what he says. Palestine, Syria is not devoid of moral excellence either. It is home to quite a large share of the most populous ethnos of the Judeans. Ethnos meaning like a nation, right? A people. Some among them, a body of over 4,000 by my estimate. That's interesting. That's his guess. He's been to Judea. He's just making a wild guess. They go by the name of Essenes. He thinks that name derives from the Greek word hosiotes, holiness, because they've become devoted attendants of God, not by sacrificing animals. It's not clear whether he means that they don't participate in the sacrifices in the temple, or that they simply don't think sacrifice is the way to become moral. But by considering it most important to cultivate their own minds as sanctuaries, right? Your mind is your temple, not the temple where you go to sacrifice animals. These men live the village life, keeping away from cities because of the typical lawlessness of city dwellers, knowing that there's a kind of contagion of disease in cities, not physical disease, but moral disease. So what are they like? Well, first of all, nobody owns his own house. It's the common property of everybody. They have their houses, but they welcome everybody. In addition to their living together in groups in houses, they extend a welcome to fellow enthusiasts who come from other places. So this is interesting. There are Essenes in all kinds of locations, and they travel from one place to another and know that when they get to the new place, they can stay with the Essenes there. Then they've created one supply room for all. So in each community, they share their expenses, their clothes, they share their common mess meals, using that Spartan term again. One could not find such common lodging, common regimen, common table, among others, proven in action. So he's saying, like, Greek writers talk about this as an ideal, a kind of utopia. People write about, wouldn't it be nice if we all lived together without ambition and property and competition? But nobody finds it in reality. But in Judea, you find it in reality among these Essenes.
If I could just make one quick comment.
Go ahead, yeah.
If you can go back one slide. And I'm not in any way trying to inject that this is related, but it makes me think about it. When you talk about there are a lot of Essenes throughout the area, and even though they might not be, there might be pockets where they're congregating, you could still go travel and find different places, and you could expect to be welcomed. There's a verse in the Gospels where Jesus says, when you go to a new city, inquire who's worthy, and that'd be the place where you lodge. But if they don't accept you, shake off the dust of your feet, and it'll be worse for them than Sodom and Gomorrah. But it's interesting. I'm not saying they're connected, but it does make me think about it. It seems like that's what's behind, I guess, a lot of these connections is people do what I just did, is they say that sounds like that. And it's like, you have to be careful there to say, just because they sound similar does not mean that we're talking about the identical thing. This isn't, Philo's not saying this is what the Essenes did. And since Jesus sounds similar, therefore he's an Essene. It's just interesting that was at least a common motif among different people, different religious people.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned it, because that's, I think, a perfect example of the problem. So in Matthew 10, the passage you're referring to, when he's sending out his disciples in Matthew to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and then he says, kick off the dust from your feet if they don't accept you. I think it's in Matthew 10, but that's the lost sheep of the house of Israel where he sends them out. Anyhow, there, as you said, Tim, there's an expectation that they'll be rejected because their mission is to go out and spread the word about Christ. That's not what these guys are doing, right? This is a whole different situation here. These are members of scattered communities who are simply traveling from one place to another where they will be accepted. Yeah. Right. There's no concept here of shaking off the dust from your feet because they reject you.
Yeah, like once you've got the golden key to the city, they know you're an Essene, you're good to go.
Yeah. You just head over to the next Essene community, and you know that you can find safety there.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. So I actually do think it's completely different, actually.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you raised it, because precisely people see what I would consider superficial similarities. And this is not to criticize you, because scholars in the field do the same thing all the time. In fact, I'll mention an example in a minute. But I think it's very, it doesn't, that's what I meant at the beginning by saying we need to be able to explain all the evidence, right? And this is a problem if you just spot superficial similarities. So I said that Philo has 3 accounts of them, so I'll just mention the other 2 quickly. In his, when he writes a work on the contemplative life, all right, and that's where he talks about those therapeutai, but he begins by saying, I just wrote a book on the practical philosophical life, not the contemplative philosophical life, where you sit and meditate and think like that, but on the active, practical philosophical life. Thing is, we don't have that work anymore. But he says that I used the Essenes as my big example of the active philosophical life, because remember, they're engaged in trades and so on, and then they get the income from that and share it. In his other work, it's not existent anymore, but it's quoted in extenso. It's quoted in large chunks by Eusebius in his preparation of the gospel. So he quotes from a work of Philo that we no longer have, but he quotes very generously from it, so we can get a good idea of what was in it. And he says that Philo said, the Essenes are admired by rulers. We know that from the other passage, for their virtue. And he repeats much of the information we had from the other passage, but now he mentions a few new things about them. First of all, he says they have a wide range of occupations. Any job that is innocent and blameless, they will do, right? So they will not engage in making weapons, forging weapons, or things like that, but they do engage in agriculture, animal care, husbandry, grazing herds, keeping bees for honey, and any non-violent trades. Then they take their wages from that work and they put them in the common fund, which is managed by a steward of their community, and then shared out to whoever has need. And he says they are found in large numbers. Remember, before he said they avoid the cities. Now he says they are found both in the cities and the larger communities of Judea everywhere. He also says, a very interesting and significant point, no Essene takes a wife. So all of their members are mature men. And that's quite interesting, right? So he says they kind of recruit. They're doing their thing. And then occasionally some man will come along and say, I want to join you. And Philo doesn't talk about their initiation or anything like that, but they do accept men. So their community keeps itself in perpetuity, but there are no women involved. They don't take a wife. So what's his image of the Essenes? Well, he changes a little bit the emphasis and the language. No cities because they're evil. Yes, they're in the cities. But broadly, it's consistent. They're groups of single men scattered throughout southern Syria who work hard, pool their resources in living a communal life, study scripture for moral perfection. Numbers, he's guessing around 4,000 altogether. That's not very many. So maybe, 50, 40, 30 in a given town. And you add that all up, maybe a bunch of them in Jerusalem, 100, 200, you get maybe 4,000 altogether. But then we ask, what kind of group were they? And remember now that Philo is a member of the super elite, right? He's very cultured, very philosophical, and he really, really likes the Essenes. So when we come in a little bit to ask about Qumran and what's in the scrolls, this is a question that gets largely ignored. If the Essenes were people of Qumran, of that mentality that you find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, would someone of Philo's, tastes and values and social status, would he have really thought, hey, you know what? I really like the Essenes. They're the perfect illustration of the ideal Judean for me. I don't know the answer to that question, but it needs to be asked. The second major source is nowhere near as much, so don't worry, the time is I'm going to keep you here for hours. This is fairly brief, but mainly for one reason. This is Pliny the Elder, and he lived a relatively shortened life because he died in the eruption of Vesuvius, Mount Vesuvius in 79, when he was investigating it because he was endlessly curious. But he has been honored with a beer out of California. There is actually a company making, I hope they don't mind my free advertising. I'd be happy to receive a sample, but it's called actually Pliny the Elder in honor of him. So who was he? Well, he was not a senator in Rome, so he's not at the very highest level of aristocracy. He's at the next level, equestrian. So he's a knight. That means he's quite wealthy. He's acquired some wealth, but he's in the lower nobility, you might say. And these guys, equestrians, tended to do much more real work, business. Senators were supposed to be above it all. They had their wealth in land, and they didn't work for a living. Whereas the equestrians were really the business people, the active administrators, agents, energetic types, military commanders. And so he was a soldier, he was a legal advocate, and he ended his life as the fleet commander in the Bay of Naples at the town of Misenum, where one of the two Roman fleets was based. So I mentioned that he died in the eruption of Vesuvius, and he thought very well of Titus, who was about a decade and a bit younger than he was, but he'd met him as a soldier. And so he dedicated his work that we're going to talk about now, the natural history, to Titus. He actually wrote more than 100 volumes in all kinds of different genres.
Can I clarify? Are we thinking Titus? You're not referring to Titus like in the Bible, right?
No, Titus the emperor.
Okay,
Titus
gotcha.
So there's Vespasian, who conquered Judea, but Titus is the guy who, but thank you for asking, Tim, I should have clarified that. This is a very common name in the Roman world, Titus. This Titus is the guy who destroyed Jerusalem. He's the son of Vespasian. And so Vespasian becomes emperor in 69, and Titus will become emperor in 79 to 81 CE. But this is before Titus becomes emperor. And Pliny is a good buddy of his, so Pliny's very well connected. And he writes his 36-volume natural history, 37 volumes with an introductory volume, in honor of Titus. He dedicates it to him. And it features the Flavians' conquests in Judea, which is important because their big conquest was Jerusalem. So that plays a role in his narrative. He says that he consulted 2,000 sources to write this work. But it's clear that he doesn't just copy sources. He writes in his own style and language, just like Pliny did, or just like Philo did, pardon me. And that's important for understanding these texts, because he's not simply taking a script about the Essenes from somewhere. He thinks he knows a little bit about them, and he's using his own language to describe them, all right, for his own purposes. So in this work, this 36-volume work of natural history, it includes lots of foreign names that the Romans readers would not know about. And at the beginning, he apologizes for that. So I'm going to be mentioning a lot of place names and people's names that you never heard of, and I don't want you to get bored. But, you know, we're Romans, and we care about facts, and I'm giving you the facts about the world. But I'm going to include a lot of marvelous stuff, wonders, amazing things, just to spice up my narrative. So whenever I hear about an amazing thing, I'm going to mention it just to spice it up. And the Latin word is mirus, mira, for these marvels. So he doesn't provide any new content about the Essenes really over what Philo said about them, but he mentions them. The reason Pliny mentions them is he considers them amazing. Why does he consider them amazing? Well, he uses this language about mira, but curiously, the reason scholars have paid attention to Pliny is not because of what he says about the Essenes, which does not really fit Qumran very well, but because of a line that he says about their location. But caution is needed here, and I'm going to dwell on this a little bit, because this is what underlies the Qumran-Essene connection, and you have to be very, very careful. So he approaches, in his description of the Roman world, natural history, he approaches Syria from the west, from Egypt in the southwest, and then he goes up the coast and then inland. He describes the coastal sites, then inland, and then the main bodies of water, the two main bodies of water in Judea, which are the Sea of Galilee, as we call it, or Kinneret Lake, connected then by the Jordan River down to the Dead Sea. So he says that the Jordan River kind of wanders reluctantly because it's fresh at its source and life-giving and full of life and vitality, but it doesn't want to go south. So he kind of personifies the river and says because the Jordan River wanders quite a bit back and forth, and he says it does that because it doesn't want to be consumed by the foul, stinking Dead Sea, the lake called Asphaltitas, because it's full of bitumen asphalt. So he describes the Sea of Galilee by going first to the east, then to the south, then to the west in a clockwise way. And then he goes down the river, and then he does the same thing with the Dead Sea. So his distances, his measurements are all off. He says the Dead Sea is like about 6,000 square miles equivalent. It's really about 300 square miles. It's big, but it's not 6,000 square miles. Anyway, he gives this clockwise description. He says on the east is Arabia. On the east of the Dead Sea is Arabia and the nomads. On the south, he mentions two towns, which are not actually on the south, they're on the east. And then on the west, he says, are the Essenes. So here's his approach. He comes in like this from Egypt, then he goes up the coast, then he goes inland and down from the Sea of Galilee there, the small lake, to the big lake in the south following the Jordan River. So a little bit closer view. When he goes like this, he says, okay, on the east of the Sea of Galilee are these two towns. On the south is this town, Tarichea. Then on the west is Tiberias. And then he goes down the Jordan River from there. And he says, on the east of the Dead Sea it is faced by Arabia of the nomads. Then on the south by Machaerus and Caliroe on the south, the hot springs. And then to the west, the Essenes flee the shores far from where they cause harm. So he's saying that the lake stinks. It's got a foul smell full of bitumen. And they stay far away from the shores. Who are they? They're a solitary tribe and amazing beyond all others in the world. Why? Because without any women and having renounced all sexual interest, without money, so all the things normal people value and live for, men value women and money, they have only, and he jokes about this, their company is palm branches. That's it. But without any sex, their group is still kept going because other men, tired of life and the reversals of fortune, so people are fed up with trying to make a living, crowd there for their manner of living to join them. And so for thousands of ages, this is a point I mentioned before, Tim, when you asked how old they were, for thousands of ages, it's remarkable to say a tribe is eternal in which no one's ever born. That's how good it is for them that other people get fed up with normal life and come and join them. Now, he says, below them used to be the town of Engedi. I've given the Latin here in case any readers know a bit of Latin. Infrahos Engada, opidum fuit. So it used to be the town of Engedi, second only to Jerusalem. Fertility, it's a very famous town, now a ruin just like Jerusalem because the Flavians have destroyed these places. But the Essenes apparently still survive. So they are above. So Engedi was below them. What does that mean, above and below? And then after that, is Masada, a fortress on a crag, and that's Judea. That's what I have to say about Judea. So to visualize this, he says, okay, on the east are the nomads. That's Arabian territory with the nomads. On the south are these two towns. And on the west, you have Essenes. That's Pliny. So his Essenes kind of match the nomads. He doesn't say anything about an Essene settlement at all, or a particular place. He just says to the west of the Dead Sea, far away from the shoreline, by the way. Notice, if you can see my cursor, notice where Hervet Qumran is. It's right on the Dead Sea. Whereas Pliny says, no, they're very far from the Dead Sea because they stay away from its noxious fumes. And below them is Engedi. So Engedi was a very famous place, and he's just saying that the Essenes are above, that is, up in the hill country, and Engedi is below. Now, if you ask, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was saying it's fascinating.
Yeah, go ahead.
With his description there, I can't help but wonder when he talks about people coming in and, you know, they don't have children, you know, because they're not married, but they're still growing.
Or they left them behind, or their children are grown. Yeah.
Yeah. I've heard some reference, and I apologize, I forget where it's from it, that there was some group, either the Qumran group or the Essene group, that was known for taking children in. Is that related? And there's been some conjecture of, was John the Baptist one of those people, like when his father was killed, that his mother had the need to take him somewhere to keep him alive, and so she may have dropped him off with the Essenes. Is that related at all?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. We're coming to that.
Okay.
That's actually in Josephus.
Okay, I'll hold off then.
He gives a slightly different version, indeed, of this. Okay. So if we ask, are we sure that this is what Pliny meant? Well, we do have a check, because we can figure out how ancient audiences understood him, because there was a guy named Solinus who wrote a book called Remarkable Things in the early 3rd century, early 200s. And what he did a very, like a Reader's Digest version of Pliny. So Pliny writes these 36 volumes, right? This massive amount of natural history, geography, plants, and all that stuff. This guy, Solinus, said, you know what? I see an opportunity for a book here. I'm going to just pull out all the really interesting things from Pliny. I won't bother with all the details about science. I'll just pull out all the marvels from his account for the sake of entertainment, and I'll just put them together. So he retells the story of the Essenes in his own language, paraphrasing what he understood Pliny to be saying. And here we get a pretty clear picture of how what we would have thought Pliny meant is actually what he meant. Because he says the interior parts of Judea toward the west are held by the Essenes. Notice there's no settlement there. It's just the zone, right? In other words, Pliny had called the Dead Sea the Lake of Judea. He said that's the Judean lake. That's their big lake. So when he says that the Essenes are west of there, up in the hills, that's all he means. They're in Judea. The town of Engedi used to be below the Essenes, and now it's completely destroyed. So this is his paraphrase of Pliny. And what it shows is that Pliny did include that digression on the Essenes in order to be entertaining, because that's why Solinus copied it. And what his meaning is Essenes are inland, up in the hills to the west. And Masada, see what he says about Masada, he completely detaches that and says the boundary of Judea, by the way, is the fortress of Masada, right? So he's not saying that Masada is south of the Essenes or anything like that. He's just saying, by the way, I'm talking about Judea. Masada is, you've all heard of Masada because that's a famous place in Rome now, where Flavius Silva conquered it. You've heard of Masada. Well, that's the end point. That fortress is the end point of Judea. So to come back to the map I had before then, Masada is over here. If you can follow my cursor, it's right there, right? And so he's saying, he understands Pliny to say, all right, there are those people, and the Essenes are in the interiora, the interior parts of Judea. Below them is Engedi. You've all heard of Engedi. Well, that's down on the lakeshore, down from the heights. And I've been describing Judea. Where's the last part of it? Masada. Masada marks, which is correct. You see, even on this map, the boundary line there were no border posts like we have today, but in fact, Josephus also indicates that Masada was the southernmost fortress in Judea. So that's all Pliny seems to be saying, right? And scholars who read Pliny's description of the Essenes before the Qumran scrolls understood that. So let me just give you a quick set of examples. So John Lightfoot in the 1600s, he said the Essenes were around Arad, which is way south, west of Masada. Lieutenant Lynch, who was in the U.S. Navy, he explored the region in 1848. He wanted to go and look at the caves above En-Gedi because he said that's where the Essenes were. Similarly, 2 years later, the French explorer de Saussure says, Pliny informs us that the Essenes inhabited the western coast of the Asphalt Lake. Geikie in 1879, upper valley of En-Gedi, where Pliny tells us most of the Essenes had settled. Charles Wilson, in Inhospitable Shores, that's where the Essenes were off the shores. Kaufmann Kohler, the Essenes at En-Gedi. Bauer, Pliny locates Essenes on the west side of the Dead Sea in and around the city of En-Gedi. Now, Emil Schur, who wrote this very famous manual of history of the time, said, well, he wants to challenge his fellow scholars, but look how he does it. He says, yes, Pliny mentions En-Gedi as, a reference point, but remember Philo and Josephus, we would be much mistaken if we were, according to Pliny's description, to seek them only in the desert of En-Gedi. That's not what he's saying. They're also throughout Judea. So these scholars understood Pliny to be compatible with Philo, who says they're everywhere throughout Judea, but they're in Judea, that is up in the hill country, and En-Gedi is below them on the lake. So all three sources were thought to be compatible and not contradictory at all, because they all put Essenes up in the hills of Judea. So to summarize, Pliny adds nothing to Philo's substantive account. He still understands them to be all male communities who lead an extremely simple life, mainly found outside the cities. But he views them as a marvel or curiosity and says that, men who are bored of life go and join them, because he's very much not bored of life, right? That's meant to be a dig. Pliny is, a very vigorous guy who's always exploring, always writing, going around military stuff. So he's having a bit of a laugh at these guys. They cut themselves off from women and from money, and but they do stay away from the smelly Dead Sea, matching the nomads on the east side. Okay. Finally, Josephus. Now, a quick introduction of Josephus. He's a very proud spokesman for Jerusalem's elite. He's a wealthy priest, aristocrat, right? Very much part of an establishment man. He gets sent on a mission, an embassy, a diplomatic mission when he's only 26 years old, to go to Rome to help free some prisoners, some Judean prisoners there. So he's a very skilled, well-educated, Greek-speaking Judean from Jerusalem who really knows the world, right? He's comfortable in the world. He's read a lot of history, philosophy, and so on, as comes through in his writings. But he's captured by the Romans when they come into the region during the war, and is taken prisoner and taken to Rome, where he writes. He's freed in Rome, becomes a free citizen in Rome, and then he writes 30 volumes defending the Judean people and their character against the general. After a war, you can imagine, like after the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, people often have a very dim view of the enemy, right? Same in the Second World War. You kind of downplay, you ridicule your enemy. So you can imagine Josephus living in Rome when the Judeans have been defeated by the Romans. He decides he's going to write works defending their character and their history and their laws. He's the only author who groups, this is really interesting, who groups the Essenes with Pharisees and Sadducees to say, we Judeans have three philosophical schools, just like is popular in Greece and Rome. You have, like Platonists, Stoics, and Pythagoreans or something like that. you have a bunch of philosophies. We have three. But he's the only one to do that because, Pharisees are mentioned by many other authors and Sadducees in the New Testament, in the rabbinic literature. But nobody else thought to group them with Essenes. But Josephus seems to do this as his own kind of creative measure. So to come back to your question, Tim, then at the beginning, this is what I wanted to say, and then I'll let you elaborate.
No, what you're saying is exactly what I was going to ask about.
Okay, so why are they not in the New Testament?
Or are they?
Why are the Essenes not in the New Testament?
No, not. I don't mean it like, I know they're not listed, but like, are they there? They're not mentioned explicitly, but implicitly.
I don't think so. I don't think so. But the reason is, what I want to say is this notion that they should be there is because we think there were three schools. The reason we think that is because Josephus said there were three schools, right? But actually, nobody else living at the time would have known there were three schools. That's Josephus's construction, right? Because his way of writing to his Roman audience is to say, hey, we've got three philosophical schools. Nobody in Judea apparently would have thought that we had three philosophical schools, right? That's Josephus's way of communicating. So therefore, it's not shocking that the gospel writers mention Pharisees and Sadducees as the main competitors having different views of the law, because Essenes, even if they knew about them, they would have seen them as completely different, right? A different kind of group altogether. It's like saying, like if you're in Britain, say, we have three groups. We have the conservatives, we have labor, and we have unions. Or something like that. Do you see what I mean? Or yeah. They're not necessarily groups that anyone else would put together.
But what I mean is, if I've heard this before, the conjecture, and it's obviously just conjecture, but the reason that they're not listed is because it's from their vantage point. It's given from their vantage point. Like they are there. They're the ones telling the story. They're not going to talk about themselves in the third person, in the sense that they're just describing, we like if America had three parties, we only have two for the most part, but say we had some, ultra green, ultra socialist party that came up, that was like, now we got truly three equal parties, and the Green Party is talking, and they're going on and on about Republicans and Democrats. Yeah. And someone, centuries later reads about it, they'd say, I thought there was three, but I'm only reading about Republicans and Democrats. Well, that's because they're just saying it. This is what we experience as a group, as we experience these people interacting with us.
Yeah, look, it could be, Tim. Almost anything is possible. But then what you need to do is show why you think that, why you would think that the gospel writers thought they were Essenes. That's already a big problem. What I'm trying to suggest to you is that if you go back to my image of reality as being chaotic, right, and not explaining itself, it doesn't come with labels and saying this is the meaning of me or us, right? So when you look at other sources, Pharisees appear, right, quite a bit. And then Pharisees and Sadducees appear, and Pharisees appear with scribes and teachers of the law, nomodidaskaloi, people like that. And then in the rabbinic literature, you have Boethusians and Sadducees, and there are all kinds of various groups around. What I'm suggesting to you is there's nobody else had a motive, nobody else thought that Essenes should be included alongside them. So it could be, yes, that the vantage point of the authors is Essene, and so they didn't talk about themselves. But a simpler explanation, I think, is that no one else thought of putting them together. They weren't relevant because the ones who naturally are together, as in rabbinic literature, right? In rabbinic literature, too, you see Pharisees and Sadducees opposing each other on legal things. Essenes are not part of the picture. Essenes do not appear in rabbinic literature, not because the rabbis are Essenes, but because they never thought this was a group that should be compared with Pharisees and Sadducees.
Yeah, I think one of the arguments, or at least the conjectures that's come up is it seems very strange that the Essenes suddenly died out at the time that the Christians appeared. And
no, yeah, I get it. I get it. But it's not strange. Historically, everybody died out. The Sadducees died out. The Pharisees died out.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, everybody died out. Who,
right. But I mean, at the exact same time.
Well, no, they all died out at the same time. That and the priests, the priests as a functioning body died out because they couldn't offer sacrifice anymore. I mean, the priestly lineage still survives till today, but they couldn't function as priests anymore. I mean, the destruction of Jerusalem was catastrophic, and it wiped out all these groups. So it's not actually so strange. I mean, it depends. That's why I keep saying it. Well, why do you think it's strange? Why do you think the Essenes would be mentioned? Anyway, there's still other options. Another option would be that, say, the author of Luke Acts, who's quite philosophically minded, he might have thought of mentioning the Essenes and might not have done so, not because Christians were Essenes, but because they were competition. So in Acts, the Christians get together, have no property of their own, share meals together, right? Now, one might say, therefore they're Essenes, but that's a big leap because it doesn't explain all the evidence, right? They're not Essenes, they're Christ followers. Essenes are not Christ followers. So these people are getting together to worship Christ, who died and rose from the dead and is the savior of the world. That's not being an Essene. So one way to explain all that is just simply to say they didn't, even if they knew about Essenes, there was no reason for them to mention them, partly because they would have seen them as sort of competitors. One thing we have to keep in mind here is that just because these traits are attributed to the Essenes doesn't mean they're exclusive to the Essenes. As I mentioned before, the Spartans were the most famous whole city of people who lived like this, right? And they actually did in real life. They shared all their possessions. They had meals together in a very radical way. And they provided a kind of model of society. Many Greek philosophers thought, well, it's not really going to work because people aren't like that. Most people won't like this kind of living. But what a nice ideal, right? To live like Spartans. And many philosophers, Greek philosophers, dressed as Spartans did. They wore beards and they wore rough cloaks to look like Spartans to show they were philosophers, right? So this Spartan image and this kind of utopian image of living together, sharing goods was widely spread. In Alexandria, the museum, from which we get the word museum, was actually a group of males who lived together and shared their stuff and ate common meals and lived this philosophical life. The Pythagoreans, right, followers of Pythagoras, did this long before. And Josephus compares the Essenes with Pythagoreans. So what I'm trying to get at is I see why people make the quick identification. That looks like Essenes. I think they were Essenes. But actually, it's much more complicated than that. I'm not saying it's impossible. It's possible. Almost everything's possible. But there's a lot of, like, I don't know if you ever saw, you're too young to have seen I Love Lucy, but.
No, I did. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Ricky used to say, you got some splaining to do. There's a lot of splaining to do here. If you think, I'm not saying it's impossible, but historians have to explain evidence at the end of the day. And there's a huge amount of evidence that simply wouldn't fit that hypothesis. And it's no good just to dismiss it and say, well, I believe it anyway.
Right.
That's fine if you're not a historian, but okay.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. I don't want to cut you off.
No, you answered my question. That was great.
Okay. And he's not only the only author to group these three together, he's also the only one to name individual Essenes. And that's very interesting because he names these guys in Judas, Simon, Menachem, who are teachers with students in Jerusalem. He locates these guys and calls them Essenes, says they had a student following, And they lived and taught in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem also has an Essene gate. One of the gates of the walled city was called the Essene gate. He says the Essenes are renowned for especially their predictions of the future, and that's why they were consulted and respected by both Hasmonean rulers and King Herod. Remember that line in Philo about even brutal rulers respect these people, probably because they're afraid of them, if they think they can tell the future, in the same way that Roman emperors were afraid of astrologers, same kind of thing. So Josephus really admires the Essenes and mentions them often just like Philo, in the sense that they illustrate the best Judean values. And especially he focuses on, in his Judean war, that they are tough. They are tough men. They are like Spartans. They do not get high on pleasure. They don't seek out pleasure. They don't love pleasure, which most people do. And they don't fear suffering or death. They hold both pleasures and death in contempt. They're just devoted to virtue. You can see why most people could not live this way. But they lead extremely simple, disciplined life, sharing their property and meals. So his account is going to be very much like Philo's, but it's independent. And this is important for the historian. If you have independent accounts that look similar, that's a godsend, because it happens very rarely. And so that helps you to see that the reality behind them must have been, what you see, something like that, because otherwise two independent people would not have the same impressions. Just before I continue, I should point out that Josephus really likes ring composition, that is to say, concentric ways of writing, and he lays out his entire war in a kind of ring compositional structure. At the center of it is the pivotal moment, and then you have matching panels. Like, for example, he says at the very beginning that he's going to discuss this fellow Onias and the temple he built in Egypt. He says, I'll talk about it later. Well, he only talks about it later at the very end of book 7. And then if you step in at various steps along the way, you have matching panels on the way out, right? With matching phrases and things like that. And this was a common stylistic thing to do in the ancient world, because it gave a sense of shape and closure to a work, right? You see it even in essays in newspapers, sometimes opinion columns or essays. Good writers will open with something, then they'll go off and discuss what they're doing, and they'll come back at the end to what they started with, right? It creates a ring to create a sense of wholeness. And the reason I mention that is that his Essene passage in War II, his biggest description of the Essenes, has such a structure. So it begins by talking about 3 schools, Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. But then he forgets about Pharisees and Sadducees, and he just elaborates at great length on the Essenes. And then he comes back at the end, right? So these are the passage numbers. And comes back at the end and says, oh yeah, Pharisees and Sadducees, yeah, well, they disagree with each other on these things. So even Josephus does not usually bring Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes, all 3, into conversation. So even in this passage, right, he just pushes the Pharisees and Sadducees aside. And elsewhere in his work, he often talks about the Pharisees and Sadducees together without mentioning the Essenes. So even in Josephus, you can see the artificiality, I think, of this 3-school construction, that nobody else would have noticed it or thought to put it like that. But he does it for his own reasons in a few places, just to say to his Roman readers, yeah, we have 3 schools of philosophy, right? But most of the time he keeps them separate. He talks only about the Essenes, or he talks only about Pharisees and Sadducees, right? But occasionally, on 4 occasions, he brings them together, all 3, to say we've got 3 schools. So, we can't go through the whole thing, but he talks about women and children. No, we don't have them. Then he says they are despisers of wealth and pleasure. And then, so this is all moving toward the center. He talks about how they elect their leaders, talks about their worship of the sun. Very non-Jewish, very interesting. They prayed to the sun to rise. And then in the middle of the whole thing, he talks about their initiation procedures. And he says they take 12 oaths, and he spells them out. And then once he's done that, he goes back to, he talks about their toilet practices, how they cover up when they dig a hole in the ground to relieve themselves so that they don't offend the rays of God. That's, again, quite amazing. And then he talks about their leaders, and then he says they're despisers, using the same Greek words. Now, he said before they despise wealth and pleasure. Now he says they are despisers, I think kataphronetai in Greek, of terrors and death. Now, when he talks about women and children, he says, well, actually, there is a kind of a special group of them that do get married strictly for the purpose of generating children. They don't enjoy the sex. How he knows this, we have no idea. That's but awesome. they just do the sex thing for procreation. That's it. So as soon as a woman's pregnant, you stop having sex because she's already doing her job, and it's strictly a baby factory. But that's a curious passage, which I think we don't have time to get into, Tim, because elsewhere in his later accounts in Antiquities 18, he will say, just like Philo and Pliny said, no Essene takes a wife. So I've written about this elsewhere and argued that this was, he only included this for the sake of kind of aesthetics and to open a window to say that he is kind of an Essene himself. Because he gets married 4 times, at least 3 times, possibly 4, and has children. But he loves the Essenes so much that a logical question would be, well, if you love them so much, are you an Essene? So I've argued in a couple of publications that I think this is most easily explained by his opening a window for himself to say that, I'm kind of an Essene too, even though I've been married and have children.
Like in his mentality or worldview.
Yeah, exactly. That he's part of this virtuous, crowd, something like that. Anyway, to give you a taste of his account, 3 forms of philosophy are pursued among the Judeans. So here's what I was talking about. He wants to say we've got 3 schools. The members of one are Pharisees. And notice, by the way, Philo doesn't do that, right? He never thinks. So Philo just talks about Essenes, right? By themselves. He has no idea that they're comparable to Pharisees and Sadducees. Anyway, he says, now these guys are Judeans by ancestry, but they're very affectionate toward, more affectionate than others to each other. They shun pleasures as a vice, self-control. They have contempt for marriage. So this doesn't fit with what he says at the end, because here he says that on principle, they don't trust women. They protect themselves from the wanton ways of women. They realize that, children are necessary, otherwise the human race would die out. But what they do for that is they take in the children of others. So adopting the children of others while they're still malleable enough for the lessons, they regard them as family and inculcate their principles of character in them. So that's what he says, which is a bit different, right, from what Pliny said and what Philo kind of implied. So, but it's a small difference because all of them are saying that they recruit, people from outside, whether as children, what's the age limit for children, who knows, whereas the others focus on, Pliny focuses on adult men.
Just a real quick question on that note then, do you think there's any validity to the conjecture that John the Baptist may have been in that group, may have been adopted?
Anything may have been. This is the problem, Tim. Almost anything's possible. We don't know much, is what I try to emphasize. We don't know much about what really happened in the ancient world. But if you're a historian, you have an obligation to try to explain the evidence. And if you hypothesize John the Baptist was an Essene, then you have to explain what evidence that helps with, right? And actually it creates problems because John the Baptist is a very singular character, both in the Gospels and in Josephus. He's a very singular guy who's out there with a massive following, and he has his own way of dressing and stuff there's nothing communal about John, right? So, and the whole thing about the Essenes is communal living, living together, sharing stuff. That's not the picture you get of John anywhere. So, yes, it's possible. It's possible. But I think part of the problem is that the people who, most of us come from Protestant backgrounds, which are anchored in belief and theology, right? So we tend to spot, there's a theological similarity, but the world doesn't operate on theology, right? And never did. It operates on practice and social stuff and community and social bonds, right? So actually there's a huge amount of evidence that will be very difficult to explain if John were an Essene. It doesn't mean he wasn't. Maybe he was a renegade. This is what I was saying before. You can make any argument sort of airtight by saying, well, he was different. He was an Essene, but he was a renegade Essene, or he left the Essene group. Okay, but why do you think he's an Essene in the first place? Where's the compelling evidence that he was? Or put it another way, what's the evidence that is better explained by his being an Essene than not?
Yeah,
that's the problem. You see what I mean?
Yeah, that was good. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think I'm going to do some more digging, and maybe if we do a follow-up next year, I'd love to, or in a few months, I'd love to dig into that one a little bit more with you. But I definitely need to get some more background as to why people say that. But I appreciate your perspective on that.
Okay, I think I need to move on now, so that this doesn't go too long. And I won't dwell more on what Josephus says, except that to show where he says here that before the sun rises, they utter nothing about earthly things, but they address prayers to him as if begging him to come up. And then they go wash in frigid water and so on. They make these dreadful oaths. Oh, there's one thing I should mention quickly is that he has this line about how they guard against spitting into their middles or to the right side, or into middles, it says in Greek, or to the right side. And even more than other Judeans, against working on the Sabbath day. So every Jew doesn't work on the Sabbath day, but they're even more strict about this. They won't even go to the toilet on the Sabbath day. They're extremely strict. About going to the toilet, however, on other days, they are given a little hatchet when they join the order. And the purpose of that little thing, the trowel, is to every single time they go to relieve themselves, number two, we might say, they have to dig a hole and bury it. And they wrap their cloak around them so as not to outrage the rays of God. Right? So this is a very interesting, curious Judean sect, and then they wash themselves off. Josephus says you don't really need to because it's a perfectly natural function, relieving yourself, but they do, as if they'd become polluted. So remember, the ancients have no idea of bacteria or things like that. They see purity in much simpler and more ritual terms. Then he emphasizes here, and I'll just close with this, their contempt for death. This is where he talks about how when they were tortured, they smiled in their agonies. So this is a big reason for Josephus to mention them, is that they really don't care about suffering and death, just like they don't care about wealth and pleasures and privileges. And the other thing I want to say then, aside from the Essene passage, it links up with many things he says about Jews in general. So here's a passage where he's not talking about Essenes. In his last work, the Against Apion, he's talking about the whole Jewish people, the whole Judean community. Look at what he says. I want to speak briefly about our whole political constitution. I think it will become clear that we have laws optimally oriented toward piety, toward community with one another. He's using the same language that he used of the Essenes, toward humanity and justice. Those are the two oaths that the Essenes swear. He says, what greater beauty than piety? What greater justice? Piety and justice are the first two oaths of the 12 that the Judeans swore, to observe piety toward God and justice toward each other. So this language shows that he is incorporating the Essenes. The reason he mentions them and loves them so much is that he thinks they embody the core values of being Jewish. So Josephus, like Philo, admires them for this reason. And that is, when we come to Qumran, that raises some questions we need to answer. So in the last few minutes, what I'd like to do then is have a quick look at Qumran and the scrolls and the site, and what about this triangle of connections? We've looked at the Essene descriptions mainly. Now I would like to look briefly at the site and the scrolls. So here's the site, just to give you quick orientation. There's the Dead Sea, there's the Qumran site, and this escarpment right close to the photographer here. I think this is an image from Todd Bolin. He has wonderful images of the region. That escarpment I want to mention again, but you see where it is in relation to the site of the residential site of Qumran. So looked at from another side, there's the escarpment, that is the rise of the hills in the background. And you have this residential site on what's called the Marl Terrace, which is a soft rock terrace. And then you have these caves. A few caves are artificial caves cut out of the marl here, nearby the residential site here. But then most of the caves are found along there up to 2.5 kilometers away from the residential site. That's where scrolls were found, right? Now, 75% of the scrolls, however, come from what's called Cave 4, which is right here, close to the residential site. So there's a Qumran site, which is estimated to hold no more than 200 people maximum, maybe 150, maybe just 100. And around it are the caves we call 4, 5, 7, and 10. The site is on this marl terrace, and it's got a cemetery. It's got several, I think, 8 large water pools. It's got these artificial caves, and then the caves along the escarpment. Now, scholars have investigated about 60 of them. So it's a natural cave-forming sort of landscape there. And only about 10 have been found to have significant scrolls, or not even scrolls, but scroll jars or material stuff. Recently, I think 4 years ago, another cave was found, not with scrolls, but with scroll jars that were smashed. And it looked like, because there was pickaxes found as well in the cave, it looked like some modern looters, the pickaxes dated from the 1950s, some modern looters had smashed these and taken out the scrolls. And this has kind of also thrown a curve into scroll scholarship, like where were the scrolls really found? Because many of them turned up on the antiquities market with a story behind them about where they were found. But now, having found this Cave 12 with smashed scroll jars, scholars are kind of scratching their heads. Maybe they weren't found where the stories said they were found. We might have to revise all that. Anyway, so you get the idea. There's a bunch of caves on this Google terrain map. You can see the dark areas, the sharp rise. So the site is down here, and there's some caves there, but then the other caves are spread out all the way along here. And the ones with numbers on them are just the ones in which some relevant material, some either ritual objects or scroll jars or scrolls were found. The other 50 or so caves didn't turn up anything at all. Right, so the original assumption, as I mentioned at the beginning, was that there was a religious Essene community on the site that copied all these scrolls and put them in the caves for safekeeping. But then why is it that only a few caves have a lot of scrolls, whereas most of them are empty? And even the caves around Qumran, only Cave 4 really has a bunch of stuff in it, tons of stuff, whereas all the other nearby caves are virtually empty, don't have anything in them. And then stuff is in Cave 11, the temple scroll and other stuff way far away, 2.5 kilometers away. Like, what's the logic of that when most of the caves found along here don't have anything in them? So that raises a question of even whether the caves are actually connected to the residential site. What is the relationship of the residential site to the caves? Might the caves have stored scrolls from other places just because they're caves in the desert? That is, not always related to the Qumran site. Maybe other, random people came along and found the caves good storage places, because we know that from other caves farther south, that they were used for storing stuff, right? And people hid in them, not necessarily from Qumran. Now, in terms of the scroll's contents, they're in various languages, which is interesting too. So if you just thought the community was producing these texts, why are there so many languages? Some are in Greek, in Aramaic, they're even in Nabatean Arabian text, Arabian language. About 40,000 fragments have been found. So many of them are just little postage stamp size fragments. And they're estimated to come from about nearly 1,000 texts, 900 some texts. About 40% of these are actually versions of the Bible, the Old Testament. So these book copies and copies of the books, all of the biblical books except Esther are attested, and sometimes in multiple copies, like the great Isaiah scroll, for example. And they're the earliest biblical manuscripts by 1,000 years from the ones we knew about before Qumran. So for biblical studies, this is huge, because you're getting texts that are way, way earlier than the known ones. About 30% of the finds are other texts, not in the Bible, and in multiple copies, but they're texts that were known before, like the Book of Jubilees, the Book of First Enoch. These texts were already known elsewhere, and now you find Hebrew and Aramaic copies of them at Qumran. So that's interesting. So they're also copied. But about 30% of the texts are commonly known as sectarian, and that is to say they weren't known before, and they point to some kind of particular group. And they include not only community rules, like how you should be a member of a community, but also just like scribal copying exercises and things like that, and also found in multiple copies. And these are the things that are found in all those caves. Community rules, hymns, biblical interpretation, like a line of the Bible and then the interpretation, that means this, talking about a coming war. Most of these things were found in Cave 1. The community rules have attracted a lot of interest because they seem to give an impression of the so-called Qumran community, but they differ from each other. So one of them, known as CD, the Damascus Covenant, is quite different in its assumptions. It seems to assume there are married couples reading this thing with children, families, whereas the 1QS, it doesn't actually mandate celibacy, but it seems to assume a male community. So that's interesting and curious. And they all seem to have, the general ethos of the sectarian text seems to be what you might call apocalyptic. The term is debated by some scholars, but anyway, the idea is they're living in the end time. So they interpret scripture as applying to them in the last generation before the end comes. And the war scroll envisages this big apocalyptic battle. But it's also dualistic in the sense that they see themselves as a righteous remnant. There's a ferocious human struggle between God and the devil and his minions, or Satan, or various names used for Satan. It's for the struggle over humanity's soul. And so it's dualistic in that sense. There's, two-sided struggle in a cosmic kind of battle. And these people see themselves as the righteous few over against the mass who are seekers of smooth things. One expression is they look for ways around the Torah, ways around the Bible. They're slack in their observance of the law. The Jerusalem priesthood is corrupt, things like that. So very much a dissident text mentality in not all of these texts, but in many of them. Now, here's the big question. If they were Essenes, would Philo and Josephus really have loved them so much? Because remember, Philo and Josephus are both real establishment guys, right? Josephus is part of the Jerusalem priestly establishment. So if these texts are anti-Jerusalem establishment, why would he have thought, those are the perfect embodiment of Judean values? It's very difficult. See, it's not impossible.
Yeah, it's a good point, though.
but it needs to be explained, and most people don't bother explaining it. And the reason they don't bother explaining it is they get stuck on these one-for-one comparisons, right? And they see one thing that looks like something here, and they bring them together. So, for example, here's from the community rule, and it just lays out a bunch of, some of them are a little bit funny rules about, communal life. Anyone who lies down and sleeps in a session of the general membership, he goes 30 days on reduced rations because you're not allowed to fall asleep, in the communal meeting. If you get up and keep leaving without a good excuse, if you do it 3 times in a single session, well, you're going to face punishment. Up to the 3rd time punishment with reduced rations, 10 days. But if they have risen for prayer when he leaves, which is the most important thing, 30 days reduced rations. Anybody who goes around naked is going to be on reduced rations for 6 months. Anyone who spits in the midst of a session of the general membership is to be punished for 30 days on reduced rations. Now, here's an example of, I think, scholarly overexcitement. Remember that in Josephus, he said that there's a bunch of things. They observe the Sabbath very carefully. They don't spit into middles or to the right. What did that mean? Scholars just looked at spitting. They both prohibit spitting, therefore they're the same. But if you look at what it says here, it's talking about rules when they get together as a group. Right? You don't spit into the group. Obviously, that's bad manners, like going naked or wearing clothing so full of holes that people can see your penis, it says here. Then you're in trouble. These are rude things to do, spitting into the group. Now, spitting is a very common thing to do, clear your mouth out. You might do it when you're alone, but you don't do it in the group, just like you don't burst out into laughter. You don't, it's just not nice. I have been a member of many gyms that had, no spitting allowed in the shower room. They were not Essene gyms. They were just gyms because it's not nice to spit around people, even though you might do it on your own. I don't know. It's very common in some parts of the U.S. It's still very common, right? I think to spit.
Yeah. Especially if you're chewing tobacco.
Yeah. It's not considered rude. It's just what you do. So this is the last thing I'll mention as an example. Josephus cannot mean when you're in a group you don't spit, because he says into middles or to the right side. So that would allow you to spit to the left side, right?
Yep.
If you were in a group, which would not help the situation. So I would argue that what he's talking about is something different. There was a practice in the ancient world which stayed through the medieval period of spitting into your lap or to your right shoe or your right side as a good luck charm. It's a superstitious thing. And I think he must be referring to that, and not about spitting at your colleagues in the group, whereas that's what this is talking about clearly. So I don't actually see that they are the same, but scholars have made them out to be the same. I'm going to skip over this. I was going to talk about the site a little bit. The site, the main point to make here is that it's been interpreted various ways. So it was initially interpreted by a guy who was a member of a religious order who thought that it looked like a religious order because there was lots of dishware found, and then he found 2 inkwells, and there's, you see that window there. He said, well, that's a window for passing scrolls. Of course, it doesn't say it's a window for passing scrolls, but because he believed already it was like a monastery, that's how he read the evidence. But since then, a number of scholars have made other proposals, and they've examined it more carefully without his kind of background, and said it could be a scribal community, but not necessarily as seen, collecting a wide range of library texts, an archive of some kind, of disparate texts with different points of view, maybe including Jerusalem texts. It could be, one scholar argued, hey, it looks like a typical manor house that has a watchtower for protection, and it has all these pools that may be for industrial processing. Those pools used to be thought to be all for the sake of purity, but there are a whole bunch of them. There are like 8 of them, and some of them are huge. So these other scholars saying, no, that doesn't fit the purity idea. They seem to be used for something, for some kind of industrial processing. Another guy argued that it was a leftover military outpost, a mini fortress, had nothing to do with the caves around it. And the most recent, one of the most recent arguments from the Israel Antiquities Authority archaeologists, who wrote an official report, thought it was a pottery factory. It began as a military outpost in Hasmonean times, but then became a pottery factory because they found clay deposits in many of the pools and bits of pottery around. And there's so much pottery on the site that they said, hey, that's the obvious explanation. Now, curious thing is, once this idea took root, once Qumran was known about and the scrolls were identified as Essene, people began to reinterpret Pliny. So Eliezer Sukenik, who first thought that the text might be Essene, said he accepted the old understanding of Pliny, that he says everybody knows that the Essenes were farther, not there at Qumran. They were not around the caves. So he thought maybe the caves were just deposit sites for Essenes living elsewhere in the neighborhood of En-Gedi and elsewhere. And they deposited their scrolls there in these caves. But then this scholar, André Dupont-Sommer, came along in 1950 and said, okay, it's generally admitted that the Essene colony described by Pliny was near the spring of En-Gedi, towards the center of the Dead Sea. In fact, that's even what Pliny says. And he understood Pliny probably to mean that En-Gedi was below where the Essenes were up in the hills. But then he offered a new interpretation. He said, I believe this means not that what we think, but actually that En-Gedi is south of, so below meaning not lower in elevation, but south of. And that would put Essenes at Qumran. Should this explanation not be acceptable, then I give you another alternative. But hey, I think this could be possible. And notice that he's very humble about introducing this idea. He said, I realize it might not be right, but hey, could this work? But the amazing thing is that scholars grabbed onto it and said that's the only possible meaning that Pliny could have. And so he writes himself 9 years later, I first suggested this explanation, and it is now accepted by most authors. Indeed, I mentioned that Schur handbook back in 1900 or so, and it was revised to say the only location fitting Pliny's description is Qumran, right? And then I won't name the scholars here, but they say things like, these very eminent scholars say things like, there's no site other than Qumran that corresponds to Pliny. Similarly, this textbook on ancient Judaism is made clear by Pliny's description. He's talking, there's no other place than Qumran, right at the end, that could suit it. And then a famous archaeologist has written, Pliny seems to be describing from north to south, and therefore only Qumran fits this place that is upstream of En-Gedi. Notice, however, this change in understanding Pliny only came about because of Qumran. So everybody threw over the traditional understanding. The problem with this is that the ancients had words for north, south, east, and west, and they didn't think of north as up because they lacked our map mentality. They didn't have maps that we have. They didn't think of up as north. So anyway, what I simply want to say here, Tim, is that this is a circular argument, right? It used to be that people knew what Pliny meant. Now we know what he means because of Qumran. We know that he puts Essenes there because we know about Qumran. And we know Qumran was Essene because that's where Pliny locates Essenes. But of course, it's a completely circular argument. So I come to my conclusions. Look, the Essenes of Philo, Pliny, and Josephus actually present no problems. They're a fascinating group. We don't need to identify them with others. We know more about them than we do about Pharisees and Sadducees, just from those three large descriptions. That's more evidence than we have about the others. So they share very common ancient values and traits, ancient ideals with all these other groups, Spartans, Pythagoreans, and early Christians. There's no need to identify them all. They are the types that Philo and Josephus could really admire. The connections with the Qumran site and scrolls, which don't mention Essenes or anything like that, or with John the Baptist, Jesus, the Christian, are problematic. Making that triangle is problematic because the other bits don't work. Why would Philo and Josephus admire such apocalyptic anti-Jerusalem priest groups? And the nature of the site is still uncertain and up for debate. And the relationship between the site and the caves is not perfectly clear, even if there is some kind of relationship with some of the caves. And then the relationship among the caves themselves. Are they all of the same type in relation to the site? So all uncertain. And I think myself, if we just stick with the Essene evidence, that's a good starting point. And then the other stuff is just much more speculative. But we can imagine the type of group that Josephus and Philo and Pliny talk about.
That's awesome. Well, I know that we're short on time at this point, but you have, I just want to wrap up by saying you have, as always, given us a lot to think about. And I love how you whet our appetites to kind of go back and dig deeper and get more educated on these topics. So this is great. I've got a lot to chew on. So thank you very much.
Okay, my pleasure, man. My pleasure.
Yeah. Well,
Take
thank you.
And look forward to seeing you again.
Yes, sir. Thanks so much.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
See